Hey guys, tonight we're starting our journey far away from the battlefields of Europe, far away from the cheering crowds, the royal palaces, and the endless maps covered in tiny colored lines that ambitious men spent centuries arguing over. Instead, we're heading to a lonely island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. An island so remote that if you accidentally sailed past it in the 19th century, you might spend weeks before finding another piece of land. Not exactly the sort of place where one expects to find the former ruler of Europe. And yet that is precisely where our story takes us tonight. Because this is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte's final years. Not the famous years. Not the years of glory. Not the years of triumph. Not the dramatic moments when armies marched beneath fluttering flags and entire kingdoms trembled at the sound of his name. No. Tonight we are visiting Napoleon after all of that. After the victories. After the coronation. After the empire. After the disasters. After the defeat. After history had already decided that his greatest days were behind him. Tonight we meet an aging man trapped on a windswept island thousands of miles from home, spending much of his time arguing with British officials, complaining about the weather, reminiscing about old battles, and wondering whether the world still remembered him. Which, admittedly, is a rather dramatic retirement plan. So, settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back to the year 1815. Europe had just survived more than 2 decades of war. Entire generations had grown up knowing little except conflict. Kings had lost their thrones. Empires had collapsed. Borders had shifted. Millions had died. At the center of much of this chaos stood one remarkable, frustrating, brilliant, ambitious, stubborn individual. Napoleon Bonaparte. Born on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, Napoleon had risen from relatively modest beginnings to become one of the most powerful men in history. It was the sort of career path that motivational speakers would probably never stop talking about. Small island boy becomes emperor of the French, conquers much of Europe, changes history forever. Unfortunately, the story also included several catastrophic wars and a tendency to make increasingly risky decisions, which is often the problem with success. A few victories convince you that you are clever. 100 victories convince you that the laws of reality are merely suggestions. Napoleon was undoubtedly brilliant. Even many of his enemies admitted that. But brilliance has a way of encouraging confidence. And confidence has a way of encouraging mistakes. By 1812, Napoleon ruled an enormous empire stretching across much of Europe. Kings answered to him. Governments feared him. Generals admired him. His enemies respected him. Some secretly hated him. Others openly hated him. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Napoleon seemed unstoppable. Then came Russia. Now, historians have spent generations discussing exactly what went wrong during Napoleon's invasion of Russia. There are books about it. Thousands of books. Possibly enough books to build a small defensive wall. But the short version is simple. Napoleon marched into Russia with one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Russia refused to cooperate by offering the quick victory he expected. The Russians retreated. The distances grew longer. Supplies became scarce. Winter arrived. And suddenly the greatest army in Europe found itself freezing, starving, and collapsing. It was one of the most devastating military disasters in history. The emperor who once seemed invincible returned with only a fraction of the men he had taken east. And from that moment onward, the empire began to crack. His enemies sensed weakness. Coalitions formed. Armies gathered. Battles followed. Defeats accumulated. And eventually Napoleon was forced to abdicate. For many rulers, that would have been the end. But Napoleon was not particularly good at accepting endings. In 1814, he was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. The victorious powers hoped he would remain there quietly, perhaps gardening, perhaps fishing, perhaps reflecting on life, perhaps discovering the joys of peaceful retirement. Napoleon had other ideas. Less than a year later, he escaped. Because of course he did. One almost imagines European diplomats collectively sighing when they heard the news. The former emperor returned to France. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined him. Crowds welcomed him. And suddenly Europe faced the astonishing reality that Napoleon Bonaparte was back. This brief return became known as the 100 Days. It ended at Waterloo, one of history's most famous battles. And this time there would be no second chance. No nearby Mediterranean island. No comfortable arrangement. No opportunity to slip away and try again. The British government had learned an important lesson. If you exile Napoleon somewhere, make absolutely certain he cannot leave. And so they selected a destination unlike any other. Saint Helena, a tiny volcanic island in the South Atlantic, remote beyond imagination. A lonely speck of land surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. The nearest continents felt impossibly distant. Europe might as well have been another planet. For Napoleon, Saint Helena would become the final chapter of his life. A chapter filled with frustration, boredom, arguments, illness, memories, and endless reflection upon what had been lost. The man who once commanded vast armies was about to discover the peculiar challenge of having absolutely nowhere to go. And for someone like Napoleon, that may have been the cruelest punishment of all. Because battles could be fought, enemies could be defeated, empires could be rebuilt. But boredom was a far more stubborn opponent, and St. Helena had plenty of it waiting. The winds were already blowing across the cliffs when Napoleon's ship approached the island. Ahead lay the place where he would spend the rest of his days. A lonely fortress in the middle of an endless sea. And though he could not yet know it, every remaining year of his life would unfold beneath those dark volcanic hills. Far from Paris. Far from power. Far from glory. With only memories for company. The voyage to St. Helena took weeks. Weeks of endless ocean. Weeks of staring across empty horizons. Weeks during which Napoleon had little to do except think. And perhaps that was already a punishment. For most of his life, Napoleon had been surrounded by activity. There were campaigns to organize, orders to issue, reports to read, ministers to criticize, generals to encourage, or occasionally terrify. Every day had been filled with movement. Now there was only water. Water ahead, water behind, water in every direction. The former emperor of the French had spent years reshaping Europe. Now he spent entire afternoons watching waves. History can be remarkably sarcastic sometimes. Eventually, in October 1815, St. Helena appeared on the horizon. At first glance, it hardly looked welcoming. Visitors approaching by sea often described the island as bleak and intimidating. Dark volcanic cliffs rose sharply from the ocean. The coastline seemed harsh and unfriendly. There were no grand beaches, no elegant harbors, no inviting green countryside visible from the sea. Instead, the island looked almost like a fortress built by nature itself, which was precisely why the British had chosen it. Escape would be nearly impossible. The nearest major landmass was thousands of miles away. Any ship leaving the island could be spotted. Any suspicious movement would attract attention. Even if Napoleon somehow acquired a boat, which was unlikely, he would face one of the longest and most dangerous ocean journeys imaginable. For once, geography had become Britain's most reliable jailer. When Napoleon first saw the island, he reportedly understood immediately what it meant. This was not Elba. This was not temporary. This was not a setback before another comeback. This was the end. The realization must have been difficult. For years, he had convinced himself that fortune would eventually turn in his favor. Opportunity would appear. Circumstances would change. Some new political crisis would create an opening. But Saint Helena offered no openings, only isolation. The island itself measured roughly 10 miles long and 5 miles wide, small enough that a determined walker could cross much of it in a day, yet somehow vast enough to contain an entire lifetime of disappointment. The British authorities had prepared carefully for his arrival. Troops were stationed around the island. Lookouts watched the coast. Ships patrolled nearby waters. At times it seemed as though Britain was dedicating extraordinary resources to preventing one middle-aged man from taking a vacation. Then again, this was Napoleon. History had repeatedly demonstrated that underestimating him could become expensive. Very expensive. After arriving, Napoleon was initially housed at a small estate called the Briars. Compared with what came later, it was almost pleasant. The surroundings were relatively comfortable. The atmosphere was relaxed. The family living there treated him with kindness. For a brief period, life seemed almost bearable. Napoleon spent time talking with residents. He walked through gardens. He observed daily life. Visitors sometimes found him charming, which could be surprising. Most people imagine Napoleon constantly standing beside maps while dramatic music plays in the background. In reality, he could be engaging and personable when he wished. He enjoyed conversation. He liked telling stories. He could be witty, and he possessed an enormous collection of memories. After all, he had lived through events that already seemed legendary. People listened. Napoleon talked. Hours passed. For a moment, exile almost resembled retirement. Almost. Unfortunately, the arrangement was temporary. The British had selected a permanent residence for him, a place called Longwood House. And Longwood House would soon become one of the most infamous residences in history. The location sat on a windy plateau. Rain frequently swept across the landscape. Mist drifted over the hills. The weather changed constantly. The house itself was uncomfortable. Not a ruin exactly, but certainly not an imperial palace. Rooms were damp. The structure required repairs. Furniture was limited. The climate seemed determined to annoy everyone equally. Napoleon hated it, almost immediately. In fairness, many people would have shared his opinion. Longwood House had numerous problems. Water leaks, humidity, mold, drafts, maintenance issues. At times it appeared the building itself had lost enthusiasm for existence. Napoleon had once lived in magnificent palaces across Europe. He had slept beneath decorated ceilings, walked through enormous halls, received ambassadors surrounded by luxury. Now he occupied a house that thousands of miles of ocean surrounded him. British soldiers guarded the coastline. Warships patrolled nearby waters. Surely nothing could go wrong. The problem was that governments often become extremely nervous when dealing with famous prisoners, especially prisoners who once conquered much of Europe. As a result, security measures multiplied, rules multiplied, restrictions multiplied, and before long, Napoleon felt less like an exile and more like an inmate. Not that he would have accepted either description. Napoleon never truly stopped thinking of himself as an emperor. even on Saint Helena, even after Waterloo, even after exile. Titles mattered enormously to him. Status mattered enormously. Dignity mattered enormously. The British authorities, unfortunately, had a habit of referring to him simply as General Bonaparte. This irritated Napoleon almost beyond measure. To British officials, it was a practical political decision. Recognizing him as emperor carried implications they preferred to avoid. To Napoleon, however, it felt like an insult, a deliberate insult, a daily reminder that his enemies now controlled the narrative. And if there was one thing Napoleon disliked, it was losing control of the narrative. So tensions appeared almost immediately. Every conversation carried hidden friction. Every disagreement seemed to grow larger. Every minor issue became another battlefield. The irony was remarkable. The man who had once commanded armies of hundreds of thousands now found himself arguing about administrative regulations on a tiny island. History has a peculiar sense of humor. Governor Low, meanwhile, faced his own difficulties. He understood the responsibility resting upon his shoulders. If Napoleon escaped, even accidentally, Low's career would likely end in spectacular fashion, possibly accompanied by public humiliation. No governor wanted to become known as the man who misplaced Napoleon Bonaparte. So Low approached his duties with caution, extreme caution, perhaps excessive caution. He monitored visitors. He supervised movements. He enforced regulations. He reviewed correspondence. Everything revolved around security. Napoleon interpreted these actions as harassment. Low interpreted them as responsibility. The result was predictable. Mutual distrust flourished. And once distrust takes root, even ordinary interactions become exhausting. Soon the two men viewed almost everything through the worst possible lens. If Low introduced a new regulation, Napoleon saw oppression. If Napoleon complained, Low saw manipulation. If one side acted reasonably, the other often assumed hidden motives. Communication deteriorated steadily. Visitors arriving on Saint Helena frequently found themselves listening to endless complaints. Napoleon complained about Low. Low complained about Napoleon. Napoleon's companions complained about Low. British officials complained about Napoleon's companions. Everyone seemed deeply committed to being annoyed. One almost wonders whether boredom contributed to the situation. After all, when people have little else to occupy their attention, grievances can become a surprisingly popular hobby. Napoleon certainly cultivated his grievances carefully. Each restriction became evidence of persecution. Each disagreement became proof of unfair treatment. And to be fair, some conditions genuinely were unpleasant. Longwood House remained uncomfortable. The climate remained miserable. The isolation remained absolute. Yet Napoleon also possessed a remarkable ability to transform ordinary frustrations into grand historical dramas. A delayed delivery could become a political scandal. An administrative dispute could become an international outrage. An argument about supplies could evolve into a matter of imperial dignity. The former emperor never entirely lost his flair for theatrical interpretation. His companions often encouraged this perspective. Many remained fiercely loyal. They shared his frustrations. They shared his resentments. And they shared his conviction that Britain was treating him unfairly. Together they formed a small court in exile, a miniature version of the world Napoleon had once ruled. There were conversations. There were rivalries. There were rumors. There were endless discussions about politics. Human beings, it turns out, can recreate social complexity almost anywhere, even on a remote island in the middle of the ocean. Especially on a remote island in the middle of the ocean. As months became years, Napoleon's daily life grew increasingly narrow. The boundaries of his world shrank. The same rooms, the same hills, the same faces, the same arguments, the same routines, again and again. Some days he walked through the grounds. But even these excursions carried restrictions. British authorities often required supervision. Certain limits applied. Certain routes were monitored. The arrangement felt humiliating, at least from Napoleon's perspective. Imagine spending years commanding Europe and then discovering that someone wishes to keep track of your afternoon walk. Not exactly the career progression one hopes for. The humiliation lingered, and humiliation can be surprisingly difficult to endure. Physical discomfort is one thing. Loss of status is another. For Napoleon, status had defined much of his adult life. People stood when he entered rooms. Governments negotiated around his wishes. Kings feared his decisions. Now he argued with administrators. Now he waited for approvals. Now he submitted requests. The transformation was brutal. Gradually, he withdrew further into memory. The past became safer than the present, more satisfying than the present, more glorious than the present. At dinner he often discussed old campaigns. Austerlitz, Jena, Marengo, Wagram, names that once shook Europe. His companions listened attentively. Sometimes they had heard the stories before, many times before. Yet they listened anyway, because they understood what these memories represented. They were fragments of a vanished world, a world where Napoleon mattered, a world where events moved according to his decisions, a world where tomorrow promised opportunity instead of repetition. Occasionally visitors arrived from passing ships. These encounters brought excitement, fresh news, fresh faces, fresh conversations. Anything new felt valuable. Even gossip became precious. Napoleon questioned visitors about Europe, about France, about politics, about old acquaintances, about public opinion. Did people still speak his name? Did they remember him? Did they admire him? Did they blame him? The questions revealed a lingering concern, perhaps even an insecurity. For all his confidence, Napoleon cared deeply about how history would remember him. He wanted admiration, respect, recognition. He wanted future generations to see greatness rather than failure, which is understandable. Most people hope for favorable memories among friends and family. Napoleon simply hoped for favorable memories among entire civilizations. The scale differed slightly. As time passed, his relationship with Hudson Lowe continued deteriorating. By some accounts, it became almost obsessive. Every action generated suspicion. Every interaction generated resentment. The governor and the emperor, if one chooses to call him that, became trapped in their own cycle of hostility. Neither trusted the other. Neither respected the other. Neither seemed capable of compromise. It was a miserable arrangement, yet perhaps inevitable. Both men believed they were protecting something important. Lowe protected security. Napoleon protected dignity. Unfortunately, those goals rarely aligned. And Saint Helena offered no escape from either. There were no fresh starts, no changes of scenery, no opportunities to simply walk away from conflict. The island ensured that every disagreement lingered, like the wind, like the rain, like the fog rolling across the hills. The years stretched onward, slowly, relentlessly. And somewhere beneath the endless arguments, beneath the complaints and frustrations, beneath the political disputes and personal resentments, Another battle had already begun. A quieter battle. A more dangerous battle. One taking place inside Napoleon himself. Because while he argued with governors and reminisced about empires, his body was beginning to fail. At first, the signs were subtle, easy to dismiss, easy to ignore. But the lonely island had more waiting for him than boredom. More waiting for him than humiliation. More waiting for him than regret. Saint Helena was preparing the final chapter. And time, unlike any army Napoleon had ever faced, could not be outmaneuvered, could not be negotiated with, could not be defeated. It simply waited. Patiently. For most of his life, Napoleon Bonaparte had relied upon one thing almost as much as his intelligence. His energy. The man seemed capable of functioning on remarkably little sleep. He traveled enormous distances, reviewed endless reports, directed military campaigns, attended meetings, made decisions that affected millions of people, and somehow continued operating at a pace that exhausted many of the people around him. Friends noticed it. Enemies noticed it. Historians would later notice it. Napoleon possessed an extraordinary capacity for work, or perhaps an extraordinary inability to sit still. The distinction can sometimes be difficult to identify. Yet on St. Helena, something began to change. Slowly, almost invisibly at first. The transformation did not arrive dramatically. There was no single moment when Napoleon suddenly became an old man. Instead, age approached the way fog approaches a coastline. Gradually, quietly, until one day the landscape looks entirely different. The former emperor was only in his late 40s when he arrived on St. Helena. By modern standards, not especially old. Yet life in the early 19th century could be unforgiving. Years of warfare, stress, travel, responsibility, political upheaval. The strain accumulated, and exile offered little opportunity for recovery. At first, Napoleon remained relatively active. He walked. He rode horses. He spent time outdoors. He dictated memoirs for hours. He debated politics. He argued history. He analyzed military campaigns in microscopic detail. But gradually those activities became less frequent. The walks grew shorter. The rides became less common. The energy faded. His companions noticed, though not always immediately. Because change occurring over years is difficult to see. One day resembles the next. 1 month resembles the previous month. Then suddenly a photograph, if such things had existed, would reveal how much time had passed. Napoleon himself likely noticed before anyone else. After all, nobody understands the loss of strength better than the person experiencing it. His appetite fluctuated. His digestion caused discomfort. Fatigue became increasingly common. Pain appeared intermittently, then returned. Now he submitted requests. The transformation was brutal. Gradually, he withdrew further into memory. The past became safer than the present, more satisfying than the present, more glorious than the present. At dinner he often discussed old campaigns. Austerlitz, Jena, Marengo, Wagram, names that once shook Europe. His companions listened attentively. Sometimes they had heard the stories before, many times before. Yet they listened anyway, because they understood what these memories represented. They were fragments of a vanished world, a world where Napoleon mattered, a world where events moved according to his decisions, a world where tomorrow promised opportunity instead of repetition. Occasionally visitors arrived from passing ships. These encounters brought excitement, fresh news, fresh faces, fresh conversations. Anything new felt valuable. Even gossip became precious. Napoleon questioned visitors about Europe, about France, about politics, about old acquaintances, about public opinion. Did people still speak his name? Did they remember him? Did they admire him? Did they blame him? The questions revealed a lingering concern, perhaps even an insecurity. For all his confidence, Napoleon cared deeply about how history would remember him. He wanted admiration, respect, recognition. He wanted future generations to see greatness rather than failure, which is understandable. Most people hope for favorable memories among friends and family. Napoleon simply hoped for favorable memories among entire civilizations. The scale differed slightly. As time passed, his relationship with Hudson Lowe continued deteriorating. By some accounts, it became almost obsessive. Every action generated suspicion. Every interaction generated resentment. The governor and the emperor, if one chooses to call him that, became trapped in their own cycle of hostility. Neither trusted the other. Neither respected the other. Neither seemed capable of compromise. It was a miserable arrangement, yet perhaps inevitable. Both men believed they were protecting something important. Lowe protected security. Napoleon protected dignity. Unfortunately, those goals rarely aligned. And Saint Helena offered no escape from either. There were no fresh starts, no changes of scenery, no opportunities to simply walk away from conflict. The island ensured that every disagreement lingered, like the wind, like the rain, like the fog rolling across the hills. The years stretched onward, slowly, relentlessly. And somewhere beneath the endless arguments, beneath the complaints and frustrations, beneath the political disputes and personal resentments, another battle had already begun. A quieter battle, a more dangerous battle, one taking place inside Napoleon himself. Because while he argued with governors and reminisced about empires, his body was beginning to fail. At first, the signs were subtle, easy to dismiss, easy to ignore. But the lonely island had more waiting for him than boredom, more waiting for him than humiliation, more waiting for him than regret. St. Helena was preparing the final chapter. And time, unlike any army Napoleon had ever faced, could not be outmaneuvered, could not be negotiated with, could not be defeated. It simply waited. Patiently. For most of his life, Napoleon Bonaparte had relied upon one thing almost as much as his intelligence: his energy. The man seemed capable of functioning on remarkably little sleep. He traveled enormous distances, reviewed endless reports, directed military campaigns, attended meetings, made decisions that affected millions of people, and somehow continued operating at a pace that exhausted many of the people around him. Friends noticed it. Enemies noticed it. Historians would later notice it. Napoleon possessed an extraordinary capacity for work, or perhaps an extraordinary inability to sit still. The distinction can sometimes be difficult to identify. Yet on St. Helena, something began to change. Slowly, almost invisibly at first. The transformation did not arrive dramatically. There was no single moment when Napoleon suddenly became an old man. Instead, age approached the way fog approaches a coastline. Gradually, quietly, until one day the landscape looks entirely different. The former emperor was only in his late 40s when he arrived on St. Helena. By modern standards, not especially old. Yet life in the early 19th century could be unforgiving. Years of warfare, stress, travel, responsibility, political upheaval. The strain accumulated, and exile offered little opportunity for recovery. At first, Napoleon remained relatively active. He walked. He rode horses. He spent time outdoors. He dictated memoirs for hours. He debated politics. He argued history. He analyzed military campaigns in microscopic detail. But gradually those activities became less frequent. The walks grew shorter. The rides became less common. The energy faded. His companions noticed, though not always immediately, because change occurring over years is difficult to see. One day resembles the next. 1 month resembles the previous month. Then suddenly a photograph, if such things had existed, would reveal how much time had passed. Napoleon himself likely noticed before anyone else. After all, nobody understands the loss of strength better than the person experiencing it. His appetite fluctuated. His digestion caused discomfort. Fatigue became increasingly common. Pain appeared intermittently, then returned, then lingered. The symptoms were frustratingly vague, which made them difficult to understand. Doctors disagreed. Observers speculated. Rumors flourished. And throughout it all, Napoleon continued trying to maintain some sense of control. Control had always been important to him, perhaps more important than he sometimes realized. A man who spends decades commanding armies becomes accustomed to influencing events. He issues orders. Things happen. He develops plans. Others carry them out. The world responds. Illness ignores such arrangements. The body obeys its own rules, and those rules rarely consult emperors. Napoleon hated that. The uncertainty, the limitations, the inability to simply command recovery. As his health deteriorated, he spent increasing amounts of time indoors. Longwood House became both residence and prison. Again, the irony persisted. The same building that sheltered him also confined him. The same walls that protected him reminded him of exile. Outside, Saint Helena continued unchanged. The wind continued blowing. The mist continued drifting across the hills. The ocean continued stretching endlessly toward distant horizons. Nature seemed completely indifferent to human disappointment. A lesson history repeats frequently. Inside Longwood House, daily life grew quieter. Books occupied more of Napoleon's time. Conversation remained important. But even conversation demanded energy. And energy was becoming precious. Visitors occasionally remarked upon changes in his appearance. He gained weight. His face appeared fuller. Movement seemed slower. The image contrasted sharply with memories of the energetic young general who had astonished Europe decades earlier. Time had transformed him, as it transforms everyone. Though perhaps not everyone undergoes the process while the world watches. There is something particularly cruel about public decline. Private aging is difficult enough. Public aging becomes performance. Every weakness is observed. Every change is discussed. Every limitation becomes part of the historical record. Napoleon could not escape that reality. His companions recorded observations. Visitors wrote descriptions. Officials submitted reports. Historians would later examine every detail. Even now, centuries later, people continued debating his final years. Which means that in a strange way, Saint Helena never truly ended. The conversation simply continued. One of the most persistent questions concerned the cause of his illness. And this question would eventually produce theories bordering on obsession. Poisoning. Specifically, arsenic poisoning. The idea fascinated generations of writers. It possessed all the ingredients of a compelling mystery: a fallen emperor, political enemies, isolation, suspicion, an early death. What more could one ask for? Well, evidence would be helpful, and that proved somewhat complicated. Years after Napoleon's death, scientific tests detected elevated levels of arsenic in preserved samples of his hair. Immediately, speculation exploded. Had the British poisoned him? Had someone in his household betrayed him? Had Hudson Lowe somehow orchestrated a secret assassination? The theories multiplied rapidly. People enjoy mysteries, especially historical mysteries, especially mysteries involving famous figures. Unfortunately, reality often prefers less dramatic explanations. Modern historians generally believe environmental exposure may account for much of the arsenic. Arsenic appeared in numerous 19th century products. It's dust, materials, everyday items. People encountered it more frequently than modern individuals might imagine. In other words, history occasionally disappoints conspiracy enthusiasts. The truth tends to be less cinematic, though not always. Still, the poisoning theory refuses to disappear completely. Like many historical legends, it survives because uncertainty survives. And uncertainty creates opportunities for imagination. Napoleon himself certainly suspected various plots from time to time. Suspicion had become almost habitual. Years of politics encouraged that mindset. When enough people genuinely wish to remove you from power, caution becomes understandable. Yet regardless of the exact cause, one fact remained undeniable. His health continued worsening. The symptoms became harder to ignore. Pain increased. Weakness increased. Periods of illness lasted longer. Recovery became slower. The pattern was unmistakable. Something serious was happening. Doctors attempted treatment. Unfortunately, 19th century medicine often resembled educated guesswork performed with tremendous confidence. Sometimes physicians helped. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes the distinction remained unclear. Medical science still had much to learn. Patients occasionally survived despite treatment rather than because of it, which was not an ideal system. Napoleon's doctors debated diagnoses, discussed symptoms, recommended remedies, adjusted approaches, yet improvement remained elusive. The former emperor grew increasingly aware that his condition might be permanent. That realization changed him. Not immediately, but gradually, the same way illness itself had arrived. His conversations often returned to legacy, to memory, to reputation, to history. Questions that once seemed abstract now felt urgent. How would future generations judge him? What would they remember? The victories, the defeats, the laws he created, the wars he fought, the lives he changed, the lives he destroyed? History rarely offers simple verdicts. Napoleon understood that, perhaps better than most. By then he had become both participant and observer. He had lived history. Now he contemplated it, examined it, attempted to shape it. Sometimes he dictated long reflections on politics and leadership. Sometimes he defended controversial decisions. Sometimes he criticized enemies who could no longer answer back, which, admittedly, is one advantage of writing memoirs. The audience rarely interrupts. As the months passed, physical discomfort increasingly restricted his world. Certain days were worse than others. Certain mornings began with exhaustion. Certain evenings ended with pain. The rhythms of illness gradually replaced the rhythms of ordinary life. Meals, rest, medication, observation, waiting. Waiting became a major part of existence. Waiting for improvement, waiting for news, waiting for relief, waiting for tomorrow. The pace of life slowed dramatically, and in those slower moments, memories acquired greater power. Napoleon spent countless hours revisiting the past, the battles, the campaigns, the triumphs, the mistakes, the faces long gone. Some memories brought pride, others brought regret. Many brought both, because age has a way of revealing complexity. Victories no longer appear entirely victorious. Defeats no longer appear entirely disastrous. The neat categories of youth become blurred. St. Helena offered plenty of time for such reflections. Too much time, perhaps. Outside his window, clouds drifted across the hills. Seasons passed. Years passed. Europe continued changing without him. New leaders emerged. New conflicts developed. New generations grew up knowing Napoleon primarily as a story, a legend, a historical figure, not a living force. The transformation was complete. The conqueror had become a memory. Yet he remained alive, for now, still speaking, still remembering, still hoping that history would be kind. But the body that had carried him across battlefields and continents was steadily surrendering ground, and unlike his previous campaigns, this was one war he could not win. The enemy advanced silently, patiently, day by day, month by month. And somewhere beyond the endless Atlantic horizon, the world moved onward, while on Saint Helena, an aging emperor found himself approaching the final chapter he had spent years trying not to imagine. A chapter that was now impossible to ignore, as it always does. By the year 1820, Napoleon Bonaparte had been on Saint Helena for nearly 5 years. 5 years. That may not sound particularly long at first. Many people spend longer periods living in the same town, working the same job, or listening to the same neighbor explain a hobby nobody asked about. But exile changes the meaning of time, especially when there is no clear end, especially when every morning begins with the same horizon. For Napoleon, St. Helena was not simply a place. It was a condition, a state of existence, a reminder that the world he had built no longer belonged to him. And by 1820, that reality had become impossible to ignore. The years had taken their toll. The energetic emperor who had once crossed Europe at astonishing speed was gone. The man living at Longwood House moved more slowly, spoke more quietly, rested more often. His health continued to decline. Some days were manageable, others were miserable. Pain arrived without warning. Fatigue lingered constantly. The body that had survived dozens of military campaigns seemed increasingly unwilling to cooperate. And perhaps most frustrating of all, there was very little he could do about it. Throughout his life, Napoleon had believed in action. Problems were solved through movement, through decisions, through determination. Yet illness cared nothing for determination. It followed its own timetable. And its timetable was running out. The atmosphere at Longwood House gradually changed. His companions sensed it. Doctors sensed it. Even visitors sensed it. Something was happening. Something irreversible. Nobody could predict exactly when the end would come. But the direction seemed clear. The future was shrinking. Napoleon himself appeared increasingly aware of the situation. Though he continued discussing politics and history, his attention often drifted toward more personal matters. Family, legacy, memory, death. Subjects that become difficult to avoid when one's health is failing. And St. Helena offered abundant opportunities for contemplation. There were long evenings, Long nights. Long periods when rain tapped softly against the windows while wind moved across the hills outside. During those quiet hours, Napoleon frequently reflected on his past, perhaps more honestly than before. Age has a curious effect on memory. Young people often imagine the future. Older people often revisit the past. Napoleon was no exception. The difference, of course, was that his memories included emperors, revolutions, invasions, and battles that changed the course of history. Still, beneath all the grandeur remained a human being, a man who had known triumph, a man who had known failure, a man who had lost almost everything. Sometimes he spoke of France, not the empire, not the government, simply France itself. The countryside, the people, the language, the familiar places he would never see again. Exile often sharpens affection. Things once taken for granted become precious. A road, a city, a landscape, a simple conversation in one's native language. Distance transforms ordinary memories into treasures. For Napoleon, France increasingly existed only in recollection, and recollection was becoming one of his most valuable possessions. His thoughts also returned repeatedly to his son. The boy Napoleon had once hoped would inherit an empire, a child who now lived far away in Europe, a child he would never see again. History often focuses on emperors and armies. Yet some of its saddest moments occur within families. Separated parents, lost children, relationships interrupted by politics and war. Napoleon's story contained plenty of such tragedies. By the spring of 1821, his condition had worsened significantly. The periods of illness grew longer. The moments of strength grew shorter. Even basic activities became exhausting. Doctors visited frequently. Medicines were administered. Treatments were attempted. Hope appeared, then faded, then appeared again, then faded once more. It was a familiar pattern for anyone confronting serious illness. Good days created optimism. Bad days destroyed it. The cycle repeated endlessly. Meanwhile, the island remained unchanged. Saint Helena continued existing exactly as it always had. Clouds drifted overhead. Rain swept across the hills. The ocean surrounded everything. Nature remained indifferent. It neither celebrated victories nor mourned losses. It simply continued. Perhaps that is one reason remote places often feel strangely peaceful. They remind us that human dramas, no matter how immense, occupy only a tiny portion of existence. Napoleon had once dominated Europe. Saint Helena barely noticed. As April turned into May, the situation became critical. Napoleon spent increasing amounts of time confined to bed. Visitors observed how weak he appeared. The change was startling. Some remembered the commanding figure who had once inspired armies. Now they saw an aging, sick man struggling through ordinary tasks. The contrast could be painful, especially for those who had known him during the years of power. Around him gathered a small circle of loyal companions, men who had followed him through triumph and disaster, men who had crossed oceans to remain by his side. Their loyalty was remarkable. History sometimes remembers rulers. Less often does it remember the people who stay with them when everything falls apart. Yet those companions remained, watching, waiting, hoping, fearful of what seemed inevitable. Napoleon spent part of his remaining strength preparing his will. This mattered enormously to him. The document contained instructions, gifts, messages, final decisions, and perhaps most importantly, an opportunity to shape his story one last time. Even at the edge of death, Napoleon remained concerned with legacy. He wanted to be understood, remembered, judged fairly. Whether history ultimately granted that wish remains a matter of debate, but the desire itself was unmistakable. One particular request stood out. Napoleon wished to be buried beside the River Seine in France, among the French people, the people he believed had loved him, the people he had ruled. The request carried tremendous emotion. After years of exile, he longed to return home, even if only in death. Unfortunately, that wish would not immediately be granted. The British government had other ideas, and so even death could not entirely end the political complications surrounding Napoleon Bonaparte. In the final days, conversation became difficult. Energy disappeared rapidly. The once ceaseless flow of words slowed. Silences lengthened. Visitors spoke softly. Movements became careful. Everyone understood the situation, though few wished to say it aloud. Then came the last days of May. The weather outside remained unsettled. Wind moved across the island. Clouds drifted overhead. Inside Longwood House, a different storm was nearing its conclusion. Napoleon slipped in and out of consciousness. At times he seemed aware, at other times distant. Memories appeared to blend with reality. Fragments of the past surfaced unexpectedly. Names, places, battles, voices. Many witnesses later reported that he occasionally spoke of France, of the army, of old campaigns. Whether every reported statement was accurate remains uncertain. Historical witnesses sometimes improve stories after the fact. Memory can become surprisingly creative, especially when famous people are involved. Yet there is something fitting about the idea. A soldier remembering soldiers, a ruler remembering France, a man remembering the world he had lost. On May 5, 1821, the end arrived. Napoleon Bonaparte died at Longwood House. He was 51 years old. And just like that, one of the most extraordinary lives in history came to an end. No armies marched. No cannons thundered across Europe. No dramatic final battle unfolded. Only a quiet room on a remote island. A handful of witnesses, and an aging exile taking his final breath. There is something strangely moving about that contrast. For years, Napoleon had stood at the center of enormous events. Now the conclusion arrived in silence. The conqueror who once reshaped continents died farther from Paris than most Europeans could imagine. The world did not stop. It never does. Ships continued sailing. Governments continued governing. Markets opened. Church bells rang. Children played. Life moved forward. Yet news of his death traveled across oceans, across continents, across political boundaries. People reacted in different ways. Some mourned. Some celebrated. Some simply reflected. But almost everyone recognized that an era had ended. The age of Napoleon was finally over. His body was buried on Saint Helena, in a quiet valley surrounded by trees. A peaceful place, a lonely place, a place far removed from the capitals and battlefields that had defined his life. And there he remained, for nearly 20 years, far from home, far from France, far from the crowds that still argued about his legacy. Yet death did something exile never could. It transformed Napoleon completely. No longer a political threat, no longer a prisoner, no longer a rival. He became something else, a historical figure, a legend, a symbol. And legends have a peculiar habit of outliving reality. Long after Longwood House fell silent, people continued debating him, admiring him, blaming him, studying him, romanticizing him. criticizing him. The arguments never truly ended. Perhaps they never will. Because Napoleon's final defeat was also, in a strange way, a kind of victory. His empire vanished. His power vanished. His freedom vanished. His health vanished. But his place in history survived. And on a lonely island in the South Atlantic, where wind still moves across the hills and mist still drifts over the valleys, the story of his last days continues to echo. Not as the story of an emperor, not as the story of a conqueror, but as the story of a man who spent his final years confronting the one enemy nobody escapes. The strange thing about death is that it often solves some problems while creating entirely new ones. For Napoleon Bonaparte, death ended the boredom. It ended the arguments. It ended the endless rain-soaked days at Longwood House. It ended the frustrations with Governor Hudson Lowe. It ended the isolation. It ended the uncertainty about his health. But it did not end the story. Not even close. In fact, one could argue that another story was only beginning. Because throughout history, famous people have often become more powerful after death than they were during life. Not politically, not militarily, but symbolically. A living person can make mistakes. A dead person can become a legend. And legends are remarkably difficult to control. On the afternoon of May 5, 1821, Longwood House fell unusually quiet. The conversations that had filled its rooms for years faded into silence. The doctors completed their duties. The companions mourned. The servants moved carefully through hallways that suddenly felt emptier. Outside, Saint Helena looked exactly as it always had. The clouds drifted overhead. The wind swept across the hills. The ocean stretched endlessly toward distant horizons. Nature offered no special ceremony. It rarely does. For centuries, kings, emperors, conquerors, and revolutionaries had imagined themselves standing at the center of the universe. Then they died, and the sun rose the next morning anyway. St. Helena understood this better than most places. The island had watched ships come and go for generations. Now it had witnessed the final chapter of Europe's most famous exile. Napoleon's companions immediately began preserving memories. They wrote letters, recorded observations, collected stories, documented conversations. Everyone understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, or at least something historians would later find extraordinary, which, in practical terms, often amounts to the same thing. People remembered details carefully. What had Napoleon said? What had he done? What had he thought during his final days? Questions emerged instantly, and with questions came disagreements. History, unfortunately, has never been particularly cooperative when it comes to providing clear answers. Different witnesses remembered different things. Different accounts emphasize different details. Some stories grew more dramatic over time. Others became simplified. The result was predictable. Napoleon's final days quickly acquired an almost mythical quality. Certain moments became famous. Certain quotes became legendary. Whether every story was perfectly accurate mattered less than one might expect. The legend had already begun forming. And legends obey their own rules. Meanwhile, British authorities faced an awkward situation. Keeping Napoleon alive on Saint Helena had required enormous effort. Keeping Napoleon dead proved considerably easier. Yet even in death, political questions remained. How should he be remembered? How should he be discussed? What would future generations think? These questions mattered because Napoleon remained controversial. Very controversial. To some people, he was a tyrant responsible for devastating wars. To others, he was a brilliant reformer who modernized institutions and spread revolutionary ideas across Europe. To many, he was somehow both. History often prefers complexity. Human beings often prefer simplicity. The tension between those preferences explains a remarkable amount of historical debate. For now, however, the practical matter involved burial. Napoleon had requested burial in France, specifically near the river Seine, among the French people, among the landscapes he loved. The British government declined, at least temporarily. Instead, he was buried on Saint Helena. The chosen location was peaceful, a quiet valley surrounded by greenery, sheltered from some of the island's relentless winds, a place known for its natural beauty. If one absolutely had to spend eternity somewhere, on St. Helena there were certainly worse options. The funeral itself reflected a curious contradiction. Napoleon had arrived on the island as a prisoner, yet he was buried with considerable respect. British soldiers participated, officials attended, military honors were rendered. The empire had fallen, the emperor had died, but greatness remained difficult to ignore. Even enemies recognized it. Perhaps especially enemies recognized it. After all, they had spent years trying to defeat him. Nobody understands a dangerous opponent better than the people who survive fighting him. As years passed, visitors occasionally traveled to Napoleon's grave. Some came out of curiosity. Some came out of admiration. Some came because history exerted an irresistible pull. The grave became a destination, a place where people could stand quietly and contemplate the extraordinary rise and fall of one man. Imagine the contrast. Only a few decades earlier, Napoleon's decisions had influenced millions. Now his resting place occupied a small valley on a remote island. There is something deeply human about that image. Power appears permanent while we possess it. Then time quietly demonstrates otherwise. Yet Napoleon refused to disappear. Not physically, perhaps, but culturally, politically, historically. Across Europe, memories remain vivid. Veterans remembered serving under him. Citizens remembered living through his reign. Kings remembered fearing him. Governments remembered fighting him. The generation that had witnessed the Napoleonic Wars was still alive, and they talked endlessly. One veteran told stories to his children. Those children told stories to their own families. Writers produced books. Artists painted scenes. Poets composed verses. Publishers printed memoirs. Napoleon became a permanent subject of conversation. Some conversations praised him. Others condemned him. Most did a little of both. The French, in particular, developed an increasingly complicated relationship with their former emperor. France after Napoleon was not the France before Napoleon. Too much had changed. Too much had happened. The old monarchy returned. Then political tensions returned. Then arguments returned. Because if there is one thing governments can reliably produce, it is arguments. And throughout these debates, Napoleon's image remained present. Some people remembered glory. Some remembered sacrifice. Some remembered grief. Some remembered opportunity. Everyone remembered something. The years transformed him. Not physically. The man buried on St. Helena remained exactly where he had been placed. But the idea of Napoleon evolved constantly. An idea is harder to imprison than a person. An idea crosses oceans effortlessly. An idea ignores borders. An idea survives governments. And Napoleon had become an idea. By the 1830s, a curious phenomenon emerged. People who had never known Napoleon personally began admiring him passionately. Young men studied his campaigns. Readers consumed biographies. Artists depicted dramatic scenes from his life. The emperor increasingly resembled a romantic hero, which is interesting because actual romantic heroes often spend less time organizing logistics and more time staring meaningfully into sunsets. Yet reality rarely prevents mythology. The distance of time softened certain memories. Defeats became noble. Victories became glorious. Mistakes became understandable. History began sanding away rough edges. Not completely, but noticeably. This process happens often. The further events recede into the past, the easier it becomes to focus on the dramatic elements. Napoleon's life contained no shortage of dramatic elements. Poor Corsican boy, military genius, conqueror of Europe, emperor, exile, return, defeat, lonely island, death. A novelist might have considered the plot excessive. Reality apparently disagreed. Then came one of the most remarkable developments of all. In 1840, nearly 20 years after his death, the French government arranged for Napoleon's remains to return home. The event became known as the Return of the Ashes. Even the name sounds dramatic, which was entirely appropriate. A French ship traveled to Saint Helena. Officials conducted formal ceremonies. The grave was opened, and the former emperor began his final journey. At last, he was leaving the island. Not alive, but leaving nonetheless. One imagines history allowing itself a small, ironic smile. The exile that had trapped him for years could not hold him forever. The voyage back to France attracted enormous attention. Crowds gathered. Newspapers reported developments. Public interest surged. Napoleon was returning, not as a ruler, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol. And symbols often possess extraordinary power. When his remains finally arrived in France, immense crowds appeared. People lined streets. Ceremonies unfolded. Emotions ran high. The response demonstrated something important. Napoleon's political career had ended long ago. His historical career had not. That career was only gaining momentum. Over time, he would become one of the most studied individuals in human history. Generals analyzed his battles. Politicians analyzed his leadership. Writers analyzed his personality. Psychologists analyzed his ambitions. Historians analyzed practically everything. Even today, centuries later, new books continue appearing. New debates continue emerging. New interpretations continue developing. The conversation never stops. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of the story. Saint Helena was intended to remove Napoleon from history, to isolate him, contain him, prevent future disruption. In a practical sense, it succeeded. He never escaped. He never returned to power. He never commanded another army. Yet history found another path. The prisoner became a legend. The exile became a symbol. The lonely man on a distant island became one of the most enduring figures the modern world has ever produced. And as the years passed, people increasingly remembered not the damp rooms of Longwood House or the endless administrative disputes. They remembered the larger story, the rise, the fall, the ambition, the tragedy, the impossible scale of it all. Because human beings are storytellers, and few stories are as compelling as the tale of someone who climbed higher than almost anyone else and then lost everything. St. Helena had witnessed the final act, but the audience kept talking long after the curtain fell. And in that sense, Napoleon never truly left the stage. He simply became part of history itself. Time itself. When most people imagine Napoleon Bonaparte, they picture movement. They picture armies marching across Europe. cavalry charging through smoke, messengers galloping across muddy roads, generals bent over maps covered in colored pins, urgent decisions, urgent victories, urgent disasters. Everything feels active. Everything feels dramatic. Very few people imagine Napoleon sitting in a damp room on a rainy afternoon, staring through a window while wind rattles the shutters. And yet that image describes a surprisingly large portion of his final years. Saint Helena transformed one of history's most energetic figures into a man with far too much free time, which, for Napoleon, may have been one of the harshest punishments imaginable. Because boredom can be surprisingly cruel, especially to ambitious people. The island offered very little novelty. The same hills, the same roads, the same faces, the same conversations, again and again and again. Imagine waking each morning already knowing almost exactly how the day will unfold. Then imagine repeating that experience for years. That was life at Longwood House. The residence itself remained a constant source of irritation. Napoleon never truly accepted it. The building sat on an exposed plateau where weather seemed determined to demonstrate every possible mood. Rain arrived frequently. Mist appeared unexpectedly. Wind never seemed to rest. Humidity crept into walls. Furniture aged poorly. Rooms felt uncomfortable. Visitors often commented on the conditions. Some descriptions made Longwood sound merely unpleasant. Others made it sound as though the house had personally offended everyone who entered. The truth probably existed somewhere in between. Still, compared to the palaces Napoleon had once occupied, Longwood represented a dramatic fall. This was a man who had lived in places designed to impress kings. Now he lived in a house that struggled to impress basic carpentry. Every room reminded him of that reality. Every day reinforced it. Napoleon typically woke late, very late by modern standards, sometimes around 10 o'clock, sometimes even later. Partly because his health was declining, partly because there was little reason to hurry. After all, what urgent appointment awaited him? What campaign required immediate attention? What government crisis demanded his presence? None. The world no longer needed Napoleon to wake up early, a realization that was probably difficult for him to accept. Breakfast generally followed. The meals themselves became a surprisingly important part of life. When existence grows repetitive, small pleasures acquire enormous significance. Food became one of those pleasures. Napoleon had always maintained particular habits regarding meals. He often ate quickly, very quickly. Friends and servants had noticed this for years. He approached dining almost as if it were an obstacle standing between him and more important activities. Old habits die hard, even in exile. Yet meals also provided opportunities for conversation. Companions gathered. News was discussed. Memories were exchanged. Stories resurfaced. Some stories had probably been told dozens of times, perhaps hundreds. But on Saint Helena, repetition became part of daily life. There were only so many topics available. Eventually, every conversation found its way back to the past. And what a past it was. Napoleon's memories stretched across some of the most dramatic events in modern European history. The French Revolution, the Italian campaigns, Egypt, Austerlitz, Moscow, Waterloo. Entire eras seemed compressed into his recollections. One moment he sat at breakfast on a remote island. The next he was mentally revisiting battlefields thousands of miles away. In many ways, memory became his primary method of travel. His body remained trapped on St. Helena. His mind wandered constantly. After breakfast, Much of the day often involved reading or dictation. Books surrounded him. History books, classical literature, military works, biographies, philosophy, politics, anything capable of occupying the mind. Books served a purpose beyond entertainment. They provided escape, not physical escape. Nothing could provide that, but intellectual escape, a journey beyond the island, beyond Longwood, beyond exile. Reading allowed Napoleon to leave Saint Helena without ever leaving his chair, for a few hours at least. He also spent enormous amounts of time dictating memoirs. This became one of the defining activities of his final years. Companions sat nearby. Pens moved across paper. Napoleon spoke, and history took shape. Or at least Napoleon's version of history took shape, which is not always exactly the same thing. One should remember that memoirs are curious documents. They reveal information, but they also reveal intentions. People writing about their lives rarely describe themselves as the villain. Napoleon was no exception. His recollections emphasized certain events, minimized others, highlighted successes, explained failures, defended controversial decisions. It was not necessarily dishonesty. Human beings naturally construct narratives that make sense of their experiences. Napoleon simply happened to be constructing his narrative on a somewhat larger scale than most. He understood future generations would read these words. He understood historians would analyze them. He understood that battles over reputation continue long after actual battles end. In many respects, Saint Helena became the final campaign of Napoleon's life. Not a military campaign, a historical campaign. A struggle to influence how posterity would remember him. And unlike Waterloo, this campaign would continue for centuries. Outside, meanwhile, the island remained stubbornly unchanged. The weather occupied a surprising amount of attention. Visitors frequently remarked upon it. Residents frequently complained about it. Napoleon frequently criticized it. Some days heavy clouds covered the landscape. Other days fierce winds swept across the hills. Rain appeared unexpectedly. Fog rolled across valleys. Sunshine occasionally emerged, only to disappear again. The climate seemed incapable of making a firm decision. And unfortunately, Napoleon had no authority over the weather. One imagines this bothered him. A younger Napoleon might have attempted negotiations, or perhaps invaded the clouds. Fortunately for meteorology, those days were over. Afternoons often passed slowly, painfully slowly. Boredom lingered like an unwelcome guest. Some days Napoleon walked through the grounds. Other days he remained indoors. His health increasingly influenced these choices. The energy that had once astonished everyone around him continued fading. Simple activities required greater effort. Recovery took longer. Fatigue appeared more frequently. The process was gradual enough that it sometimes escaped notice. Yet the overall direction remained clear. Time was winning. Time always wins eventually. One particularly difficult aspect of island life involved the absence of surprise. Human beings enjoy novelty. A new street, a new restaurant, a new conversation, a new experience. St. Helena offered limited opportunities for any of these. The island was small. The population was small. The possibilities were small. Even visitors became familiar after a while. Novelty arrived rarely and departed quickly. The result was monotony, endless monotony. And monotony can alter the mind in subtle ways. Days blur together. Memories become difficult to organize. One Tuesday resembles another Tuesday. One month resembles another month. Time loses texture. Napoleon occasionally attempted to resist this process. He established routines, organized activities, maintained intellectual interests. Yet even the most disciplined routines cannot entirely defeat isolation, especially when isolation lasts for years. Evenings brought another round of conversation. Dinner often lasted longer than breakfast. Discussion drifted across politics, literature, history, and personal recollections. Sometimes Napoleon appeared animated. His old energy briefly resurfaced. Stories flowed effortlessly. Observations sparkled with wit. Listeners caught glimpses of a charismatic leader who had once captivated armies and governments alike. Then the moment passed. Fatigue returned. Silence returned. Reality returned. After dinner, the nights stretched onward. And nights on Saint Helena possessed their own peculiar atmosphere. The island could feel extraordinarily isolated after dark. The wind moved across open ground. Clouds obscured stars. Distant waves crashed against unseen cliffs. Everything beyond the island vanished into darkness. Europe seemed unimaginably far away. Paris felt almost mythical. The life Napoleon had once lived resembled something from another person's memory. Sometimes he slept poorly. Pain contributed. Age contributed. Anxiety contributed. And perhaps memory contributed as well. Because memory can become loud during quiet nights. Old conversations return. Old mistakes return. Old victories return. Faces reappear. Regrets reappear. The past refuses to remain silent. For Napoleon, the past was exceptionally crowded. Thousands of decisions. Thousands of consequences. Millions of lives affected. History itself seemed packed into his recollections. Imagine carrying all of that into old age. Imagine having endless time to think about it. Some memories undoubtedly brought satisfaction. Others almost certainly brought sorrow. The two often traveled together. As the years passed, Longwood House gradually became less a residence and more a world unto itself. A small universe defined by routines, weather, books, conversations, illness, and memory. Outside existed the vast Atlantic Ocean. Beyond that existed Europe. Beyond that existed history, moving forward without him. Inside existed Napoleon. Reading, remembering, waiting, watching rain slide down windows, listening to the wind, and slowly learning that some defeats arrive not with explosions or cavalry charges, but with ordinary days repeated so many times that they quietly reshape a life. For the former emperor of the French, that may have been the strangest battle of all. Not against armies, not against kings, not against empires, but against the endless sameness of tomorrow. And on St. Helena, tomorrow always seemed to arrive looking exactly like yesterday. One of the peculiar things about exile is that it creates ghosts. Not the rattling chains kind. Not the sort that appear at midnight carrying candles through castle corridors. Those belong to novels. The ghosts that haunted Napoleon on St. Helena were memories. And unlike fictional ghosts, memories rarely ask permission before appearing. They arrive unexpectedly. A familiar scent, a passing remark, a distant sound, a change in weather. Suddenly the mind is no longer in the present. It is somewhere else, somewhere years away, somewhere impossible to revisit. For Napoleon, the island offered an abundance of opportunities for memory. Too many opportunities, perhaps. The future had narrowed dramatically. The present had become repetitive. The past remained enormous. And so his thoughts wandered backward, again and again, back through victories, back through disasters, back through friendships, back through betrayals, back through love, especially love. History often remembers Napoleon the Conqueror, the strategist, the emperor, the military genius. But beneath all those titles existed something much simpler. A man who experienced affection, jealousy, loneliness, disappointment, and heartbreak just like everyone else. The difference was that his emotional life unfolded against the backdrop of empires, which tends to attract attention. Among all the people who drifted through Napoleon's memories, one name returned more often than most: Josephine, his first wife, the great love of his life, or at least the great love story of his life. History is sometimes reluctant to distinguish between those two things. The relationship had begun decades earlier, long before Saint Helena, long before Waterloo, long before imperial crowns and distant exile, back when Napoleon was still climbing toward power, back when everything seemed possible. Josephine was older than Napoleon, elegant, charming, sophisticated. She possessed a natural grace that many people found irresistible. Napoleon certainly did. From the beginning, he adored her, perhaps even more than was wise. His letters reveal astonishing affection, passionate affection, almost desperate affection. The future emperor could be surprisingly emotional when writing to Josephine, sometimes intensely emotional. One occasionally reads those letters and thinks, ah yes, the conqueror of Europe appears to have temporarily misplaced his dignity. Love has a habit of doing that, even to emperors, especially to emperors. Unfortunately, great romances rarely remain simple. Napoleon spent long periods away on military campaigns. Josephine remained in Paris. Rumors appeared. Trust suffered. Arguments followed. The relationship endured storms from almost the beginning. Yet somehow it survived, at least for a while. Then came the problem of succession, a very royal problem, and a very tragic one. Josephine never produced an heir for Napoleon. As his power expanded, the issue became increasingly important. An emperor required a successor. Dynasties required continuity. Governments preferred certainty. Political realities began colliding with personal feelings. History has repeatedly demonstrated that politics makes a terrible marriage counselor. Eventually, Napoleon made one of the most painful decisions of his life. He divorced Josephine, not because he stopped caring about her. By many accounts, he never entirely stopped caring about her. Instead, he chose dynasty over love, empire over affection, the sort of decision rulers often make, and frequently regret. Years later, sitting on Saint Helena, Napoleon had plenty of time to revisit that choice. And revisit it he did. Companions recorded numerous conversations in which Josephine's name surfaced unexpectedly. A memory here, an observation there, a story from long ago. The details varied. The pattern remained consistent. She occupied space within his thoughts. Significant space. Josephine had died in 1814, before Waterloo, before Saint Helena, before the final collapse of Napoleon's fortunes. The news had affected him deeply. Observers noticed it. Friends noticed it. Even enemies noticed it. One chapter of his life had closed forever. Now, on the lonely island, she existed only through memory. A memory that seemed increasingly precious. Because memory was all that remained. One cannot help wondering how often Napoleon replayed old conversations, old evenings, old arguments, old moments of happiness. Most people do this occasionally. Exile encourages the habit. Loneliness strengthens it. Age perfects it. Josephine was not the only ghost visiting Longwood House. Far from it. The island became crowded with absent people. Friends who had died. Generals who had fallen. Soldiers who never returned from campaigns. Political allies long gone. Family members scattered across Europe. Entire generations seemed to accompany him through recollection. Sometimes Napoleon spoke about these individuals openly. Sometimes he remained silent. But the memories persisted. After all, his life had unfolded amid extraordinary upheaval. The French Revolution alone had transformed countless destinies. People rose. People fell. People vanished. The faces changed constantly. Only memory remained reliable. Even family relationships became subjects of reflection. Napoleon's family history was complicated. Very complicated. Success tends to complicate families. Imperial success complicates them even further. Brothers became kings. Sisters acquired titles. Relatives received positions of influence. For a time, the Bonaparte family seemed unstoppable. Then came defeat. And suddenly, many of those arrangements collapsed. Some relatives disappointed him. Others remained loyal. Some relationships deteriorated. Others endured. Saint Helena provided ample opportunity to evaluate them all. Whether those evaluations were entirely fair is another question. Human beings rarely judge the past with complete objectivity, especially their own past. Napoleon was no exception. Yet perhaps the most painful family subject involved his son, Napoleon Francois, the child once known as the King of Rome, the heir once intended to inherit an empire, the boy who would grow up far from his father, separated by politics, separated by geography, separated by history itself. Napoleon spoke of him often. Not constantly, but often enough. There is something deeply sad about that aspect of the story. The emperor who commanded nations could not command circumstances. The father who shaped Europe could not shape his own family's future. Power has limits. Saint Helena revealed those limits relentlessly. One suspects that thoughts of his son became especially powerful during quiet evenings. The sort of evenings that stretched endlessly across the island. The sort of evenings when rain tapped softly against windows and conversation faded away. During such moments, the mind naturally drifts toward unfinished relationships, toward opportunities lost, toward roads not taken. Napoleon certainly had plenty of roads not taken. History tends to focus on what happened. Individuals often focus on what might have happened. What if Russia had succeeded? What if Waterloo had ended differently? What if certain alliances had survived? What if certain decisions had changed? The possibilities multiply endlessly. Exile offers plenty of time to explore them. Yet no amount of reflection changes reality. The island taught that lesson repeatedly. The past remained inaccessible. No matter how vividly Napoleon remembered it, no matter how passionately he described it, no matter how carefully he analyzed it, memory could preserve moments. It could not restore them. That truth becomes increasingly difficult as people age. The young generally believe life moves forward. The old often discover that part of life moves backward as well. Backward into recollection. Backward into reflection. Backward into nostalgia. St. Helena accelerated that process. The island functioned almost like a machine designed specifically for remembering. Few distractions. Few interruptions. Few alternatives. Just endless opportunities to revisit yesterday. And so Napoleon did. Night after night. Year after year. Sometimes the memories comforted him. Sometimes they troubled him. Often they did both simultaneously, because that is how meaningful memories usually work. The happiest moments often contain traces of sadness. The saddest moments often contain traces of joy. Human experience rarely organizes itself neatly. By the final years of his life, Napoleon seemed increasingly aware of this complexity. The certainty of youth had softened. The confidence of power had faded. What remained was perspective. Not perfect perspective. No one achieves that, but perhaps a deeper understanding than before. The conqueror who once believed he could reshape continents now spent evenings reflecting on people, on relationships, on choices, on love, on loss. And perhaps that transformation tells us something important. When power disappears, when ambition fades, when glory recedes into memory, the things people often remember most clearly are not battles, not titles, not victories, but other people. The individuals who shared their lives, the individuals they loved, the individuals they lost. For Napoleon, Saint Helena became a place filled with such ghosts. Not frightening ghosts, not supernatural ghosts, just memories walking quietly through the corridors of Longwood House, keeping company with an aging exile as he approached the final chapters of his extraordinary story. And as the winds continued sweeping across the lonely island, those memories became some of the most faithful companions he had left. By the time Napoleon reached the final years of his exile, there was one place he visited more often than any other. Not Paris, not Corsica, not St. Helena, but the past. It required no ship, no horse, no map, only memory. And memory, unlike the British Navy, could not prevent travel. The years on St. Helena had gradually transformed Napoleon into something unusual. He was no longer a ruler, no longer a general, no longer a politician. In many ways, he had become an observer of his own life, a historian examining history, a witness reviewing events that had already passed into legend. And nowhere was this more obvious than in his endless discussions about battles. The battles never truly left him. How could they? Entire continents had been shaped by them. Governments had risen and fallen because of them. Millions of people had lived or died because of decisions made in tents, palaces, and muddy fields. Those decisions remained with him, sometimes proudly, sometimes painfully, often both. Visitors to Longwood House quickly discovered that Napoleon could spend hours discussing military campaigns, not merely recounting them, analyzing them, dissecting them, reconstructing them piece by piece. Every movement, every delay, every mistake, every opportunity. The details seemed endless, and perhaps that is understandable. Battles had defined much of his life. For decades, military decisions had occupied his thoughts from dawn until midnight. One does not simply abandon such habits, especially when there is little else to do. Among all his victories, one stood above the others. Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. The so-called Battle of the Three Emperors. If Napoleon possessed a favorite memory, this was probably close to it. And historians generally agree he had good reason. The victory was astonishing. French forces defeated larger Russian and Austrian armies. The battle displayed strategy at its finest. Timing, deception, discipline, execution. Everything seemed to work, which is rare, very rare. Even successful plans usually involve confusion somewhere. Austerlitz felt different. For Napoleon, it represented perfection. or at least something close to perfection. Years later, he still spoke of it with obvious satisfaction. One can almost imagine the old emperor sitting at Longwood House, describing troop movements while rain tapped against the windows. Outside, a lonely island. Inside, a battlefield from 16 years earlier. Such was the power of memory. Austerlitz remained alive long after the soldiers had gone, long after the smoke had vanished, long after Europe had changed. Yet not every memory brought comfort. Egypt, for example, occupied a stranger place in his mind. The Egyptian campaign had been one of the most ambitious adventures of his career. Part military expedition, part scientific mission, part political gamble, part imperial dream. The entire project felt almost theatrical. Napoleon had sailed across the Mediterranean imagining new possibilities, new empires, new opportunities, new glory. Some of those ambitions succeeded. Many did not. The campaign produced fascinating discoveries and dramatic stories. It also produced logistical nightmares, military setbacks, and eventually a strategic withdrawal. Still, Napoleon rarely discussed Egypt entirely negatively. The experience fascinated him, perhaps because it represented youth, adventure, possibility. The period before he became emperor, before responsibility expanded beyond imagination. Egypt belonged to a younger Napoleon, a more optimistic Napoleon, a Napoleon who still believed every horizon concealed opportunity. Saint Helena, by contrast, concealed mostly clouds. Then there was Moscow, the memory that lingered like a wound. Of all Napoleon's decisions, the invasion of Russia in 1812 remains one of the most debated, and perhaps one of the most regretted. Not because the original idea appeared completely irrational, at least not by the standards of the time. The problem lay in what followed. Distance, weather, supply shortages, retreat, disaster. The sequence has become famous. Entire libraries have been filled analyzing it. Historians continue arguing about details more than 2 centuries later. Napoleon himself spent considerable time revisiting the campaign, trying to explain it, trying to justify parts of it, trying to understand it, which is another thing human beings do remarkably well. We revisit mistakes repeatedly, especially large mistakes, especially life-changing mistakes, especially mistakes visible from space. Russia qualified on all counts. The images must have haunted him. Frozen roads, exhausted soldiers, abandoned equipment, the long retreat westward, the gradual destruction of an army once considered invincible. 4 years afterward, Europe viewed Russia as the turning point. The moment fortune began abandoning Napoleon. The moment cracks first appeared. The moment history changed direction. Saint Helena gave him endless opportunities to reconsider those events. None of those opportunities altered the outcome. But that rarely stops people from trying. Then, inevitably, conversations turned toward Waterloo, the final battlefield, the battle that ended everything, or at least ended everything politically. Waterloo possessed a unique status in Napoleon's memory. Unlike Austerlitz, it brought no satisfaction. Unlike Egypt, it offered little nostalgia. Unlike Russia, it could not be blamed entirely on distance and weather. Waterloo was personal, painfully personal. The defeat occurred only 6 years before Saint Helena, close enough to feel recent, close enough to remain vivid, close enough that many participants were still alive. Napoleon analyzed Waterloo constantly, almost obsessively. Different decisions, different timings, different possibilities. What if certain orders had arrived sooner? What if certain attacks had begun earlier? What if certain commanders had acted differently? History is full of such questions. Unfortunately, history rarely answers them. The battle had happened. The result was fixed. Yet Napoleon continued examining it, perhaps because Waterloo represented more than military defeat. It represented finality. After Waterloo there would be no recovery, no second empire, no miraculous comeback, no new campaign, only exile, only Saint Helena, only the long decline. That realization gave Waterloo a special weight. The battlefield marked the dividing line between two lives, the life before defeat and the life after. One suspects Napoleon understood this deeply, because he returned to the subject repeatedly, sometimes critically, sometimes defensively, sometimes with surprising honesty. Age occasionally encourages honesty, particularly when there is no practical reason for deception anymore. As years passed, Napoleon seemed increasingly willing to acknowledge certain mistakes. Not all mistakes. Certainly not all. He remained Napoleon. Self-confidence did not evaporate entirely, but some admissions emerged. The Russian campaign had gone badly. Spain had become a costly problem. Political decisions had occasionally produced unintended consequences. Certain allies had been mishandled. Certain risks had proved excessive. These reflections were significant. Powerful people often struggle to admit error. The larger the power, the larger the struggle. Yet Saint Helena created unusual circumstances. There was no audience to impress, no parliament to persuade, no army to motivate, no election to win. Only companions, only memory, only time. And time encourages reflection, sometimes uncomfortable reflection. Perhaps the most striking feature of these conversations was not the battles themselves. It was the emotional tone beneath them. The victories brought pride, naturally. The defeats brought frustration, naturally. But beneath both emotions lurked something deeper. Loss. Not merely the loss of power. Not merely the loss of empire, the loss of possibility. Each battle represented a crossroads. Each decision represented a path. By the time Napoleon reached St. Helena, all those paths had converged upon one destination. A lonely island in the South Atlantic. A small house battered by wind and rain. A future measured in years rather than ambitions. The realization must have been sobering. Yet perhaps it also brought clarity. The distance of exile allowed him to see patterns invisible during action. The rise, the expansion, the confidence, the overreach, the collapse. The sequence appeared clearer in retrospect. History often appears orderly when viewed backward. Living through, it is considerably messy. Napoleon knew that better than anyone. Because he had not merely witnessed history, he had helped create it. Now he sat among the consequences, watching storms move across the hills of St. Helena, revisiting old battlefields, listening to echoes from long ago, and slowly discovering that even the greatest victories eventually become memories, while even the greatest defeats eventually become lessons. The armies were gone. The empires were gone. The battlefields were quiet. But inside Longwood House, the campaigns continued. Not with cannons. Not with cavalry. Not with marching soldiers. Only with recollection. Only with reflection. Only with an aging emperor trying to understand the extraordinary path that had carried him from the heights of Europe to the edge of the world. And as the nights grew longer, and his health grew weaker, those old battles remained faithful companions, marching endlessly through memory, never entirely disappearing, never entirely silent, because some wars end on the battlefield, and some continue for the rest of a person's life. That as Napoleon's world grew smaller, his questions grew larger. This happens to many people. When youth fades and ambitions lose their urgency, attention often turns towards subjects that once seemed distant. Life, death, purpose, faith, the meaning of success, the meaning of failure, the things that remain after everything else has disappeared. Saint Helena provided plenty of time for such thoughts. Too much time, perhaps. A younger Napoleon rarely had the luxury of philosophical reflection. There were always campaigns to plan, governments to manage, enemies to defeat, letters to answer, crises to resolve. The practical demands of power left little room for quiet contemplation. Exile changed that. The endless hours, the repetitive days, the isolation, the declining health, all of it encouraged reflection. And eventually those reflections drifted toward questions that no emperor could command. Questions about fate, questions about God, questions about death. Napoleon's relationship with religion had always been complicated, very complicated. Like many aspects of his life, he was not a man easily placed into simple categories. Some observers viewed him as deeply skeptical. Others believed he possessed genuine religious feeling. The truth probably existed somewhere between those extremes, which is where reality usually prefers to reside. Throughout his career, Napoleon often approached religion pragmatically. He understood its social importance. He understood its political value. He understood its ability to unite people. The famous Concordat of 1801, which restored relations between France and the Catholic Church after years of revolutionary conflict, reflected that understanding. Napoleon recognized that faith mattered. Whether he personally experienced it in exactly the same way as ordinary believers remained less clear. And that ambiguity followed him to Saint Helena. Visitors and companions frequently observed moments that seemed contradictory. Sometimes Napoleon spoke respectfully about religion, sometimes skeptically, sometimes philosophically, sometimes emotionally. The result left historians with endless material for debate, which historians generally appreciate. Without debate, many history conferences would become alarmingly quiet. Yet there is a difference between discussing religion as a ruler and considering it as a dying man. Saint Helena gradually shifted Napoleon from the first category into the second. As his health declined, mortality became increasingly difficult to ignore. The future no longer stretched endlessly ahead. The horizon had become visible. And once people begin seeing the horizon, they often start asking different questions. What happens next? What remains? What mattered? These questions rarely concern military strategy. They concern existence itself. Napoleon's conversations occasionally touched upon fate. The idea fascinated him, perhaps understandably. After all, few lives seemed more shaped by extraordinary circumstances. Consider the sequence. A relatively obscure Corsican officer rises through revolutionary chaos, commands armies, conquers much of Europe, crowns himself emperor, rules millions, loses everything, dies in exile on a remote island. The story almost feels fictional, too dramatic, too improbable, too symmetrical. One can easily understand why Napoleon sometimes wondered whether larger forces had guided events. The concept of destiny appeared frequently in his thinking, not always in a religious sense. sometimes almost as a historical force, a current carrying individuals toward outcomes they cannot fully control. During his years of success, he often spoke as though destiny favored him. Victories seemed to confirm that belief. Again and again, fortune smiled. Risk succeeded. Opportunities emerged. Enemies faltered. The pattern became difficult to ignore, or perhaps difficult not to overinterpret. Success has a way of encouraging confidence. Repeated success encourages certainty. Repeated success on Napoleon's scale encourages something approaching inevitability. Then came the defeats, and suddenly destiny appeared less cooperative. Saint Helena offered endless opportunities to reconsider those assumptions. Was everything predetermined? Had events unfolded inevitably? Could different choices have altered the outcome? The questions had no clear answers. Yet Napoleon continued exploring them, partly because there was little else to do, partly because they genuinely mattered. The older he became, the more philosophical his observations sometimes sounded. The conqueror gradually resembled a thinker. Not always. He never entirely abandoned his practical nature, but moments of reflection became more frequent. Observers noticed it. The man who once discussed troop movements now discussed human nature. The man who once measured distances between armies now considered distances between life and death. It was a remarkable transformation, though perhaps not an unusual one. Many lives eventually follow a similar path. Only the scale differs. Death itself became an increasingly present companion. Not dramatic, not theatrical, simply present. A reality waiting patiently in the background. The worsening illness ensured that every painful day, every exhausting morning, every medical consultation reinforced the truth. Time was becoming limited. One might imagine Napoleon responding with fear. Yet the evidence suggests something more complicated. Certainly, he wished to live. Certainly, he hoped for improvement. Certainly, he remained attached to the world. But there are indications that he also developed a degree of acceptance. Not perfect acceptance. Human beings rarely achieve that, but a growing awareness. A recognition that resistance eventually becomes impossible. The body can only negotiate for so long. Companions occasionally recorded discussions about mortality. The tone varied. Sometimes thoughtful, sometimes detached, sometimes surprisingly calm. Death, after all, had never been entirely unfamiliar to Napoleon. For decades he had lived alongside it. Battlefields tend to provide frequent reminders of human fragility. Thousands of soldiers had died under his command. Friends had fallen. Enemies had fallen. Entire armies had disappeared. Mortality was not an abstract concept. It was part of his lived experience. Yet confronting one's own mortality remains different. No amount of observation fully prepares a person for that encounter. As the months passed, religion appeared to occupy a somewhat larger place in his life. Religious services occurred occasionally. Clergy visited. Conversations took place. Whether these developments reflected deep spiritual transformation or simply the natural tendencies of old age remains difficult to determine. Perhaps both. Human motivations rarely arrive neatly separated. The desire for comfort, the desire for meaning, the desire for certainty, all become understandable when facing uncertainty. And Saint Helena offered uncertainty in abundance. One particularly striking aspect of Napoleon's final reflections involved legacy. Again and again, he returned to the subject. How would he be remembered? How would history judge him? What would survive? In some sense, these were spiritual questions as well. Not necessarily about heaven or hell, but about permanence, about what remains after death. Most people hope to be remembered by family, perhaps by friends, perhaps by a community. Napoleon faced a different scale entirely. He wondered how entire nations would remember him, how centuries would remember him. The ambition remained enormous, even in exile, even in illness. Yet beneath that ambition lay something deeply human. The desire not to vanish completely, the desire to matter, the desire to leave evidence that one existed. Saint Helena became the setting for that struggle. Not a struggle against armies, not a struggle against governments, a struggle against oblivion, against being forgotten. History eventually answered that question, quite decisively. Napoleon would not be forgotten, but he could not know that with certainty. Not then. Not while sitting in Longwood House, listening to rain and wind. Not while watching his health decline. Not while contemplating the mysteries that awaited beyond life. The nights grew longer. The island grew quieter. The future grew shorter. And somewhere in those final years, the former emperor found himself confronting the same questions that have followed humanity since the beginning. Why are we here? What gives life meaning? What survives after death? Is history shaped by destiny or choice? Does suffering possess purpose? Does success matter in the end? No emperor could answer such questions. No philosopher could answer them completely. No historian can answer them now. Yet Napoleon spent countless hours considering them. Perhaps because, stripped of power and position, those questions become unavoidable. Titles disappear. Empires disappear. Victories disappear. Even memories eventually fade. What remains are the questions. And on a lonely island surrounded by endless ocean, an aging exile sat with those questions night after night, listening to the wind, watching shadows move across walls, feeling time slip steadily away, and wondering, as countless human beings have wondered before and since, what waited beyond the final horizon. A horizon he knew was drawing closer with every passing day. By the beginning of 1821, something had changed inside Longwood House. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The change arrived the way twilight arrives on a winter evening. Slowly, almost unnoticed at first. Then one day everyone realizes the light is fading. For years, Napoleon's companions had lived with uncertainty. There have been good days, bad days, moments of improvement, moments of decline, periods when hope seemed reasonable, periods when concerns seemed unavoidable. But by early 1821, optimism had become increasingly difficult to maintain. The illness was winning, and everyone knew it, even when nobody said it aloud. Longwood House had never been a cheerful place. The weather alone made that difficult. The winds, the fog, the damp rooms, the endless isolation. Yet there had always been activity. Conversations, arguments, stories, plans, discussions about history, discussions about politics, discussions about Europe. Now something else began occupying the rooms. Waiting. A quiet, uncomfortable waiting. The sort of waiting that occurs when people understand a chapter is ending, but cannot predict the exact final page. Napoleon spent increasing amounts of time indoors, increasing amounts of time in bed. Even simple tasks became exhausting. The effort required for ordinary activities seemed to grow each week. Walking, reading, eating, talking. Everything demanded energy, and energy was becoming scarce. His companions noticed every change. How could they not? They had lived beside him for years. They recognized his habits, his routines, his moods. They knew when he was tired. They knew when he was irritated. They knew when he was pretending to feel better than he actually did. And Napoleon could be surprisingly stubborn about illness. Many strong-willed people are. They negotiate with reality, attempting to convince their bodies to cooperate through determination alone. Unfortunately, biology rarely accepts such negotiations. The companions who remained at Longwood House occupied a strange position. They were not merely servants, not merely aides, not merely friends. They were witnesses, living witnesses to the final chapter of one of history's most remarkable lives. At the time, they probably did not think about it constantly. People rarely experience history while thinking. Yes, I'm currently participating in a future documentary. Life feels ordinary while it is happening. Even extraordinary life. Yet there must have been moments when the significance became impossible to ignore. The man in the next room was Napoleon Bonaparte, the former emperor of the French, the conqueror who had once shaken Europe. And now he was dying. The contrast remained astonishing. Outside Longwood House, Saint Helena continued its usual routines. Soldiers performed duties. Ships arrived and departed. Residents carried on with daily life. The island itself seemed indifferent. Nature rarely pauses for historical events. Rain still fell. Wind still blew. Clouds still drifted across the hills. The same landscape that had greeted Napoleon in 1815 remained unchanged in 1821. Only the man had changed, and changed dramatically. There were days when he still discussed history, still analyzed campaigns, still revisited old memories. The instinct never disappeared completely. One could place Napoleon in a sickbed thousands of miles from Europe, but one could not entirely remove Europe from Napoleon. His mind continued wandering across battlefields, across capitals, across decades. The past remained crowded, and increasingly the past seemed more vivid than the present. This often happens near the end of life. Recent events blur, older memories sharpen. Moments from youth return unexpectedly. Conversations long forgotten suddenly reappear. The mind becomes an archive opening its oldest shelves. Napoleon experienced this process repeatedly. Names surfaced. Places surfaced. Faces resurfaced. Some belonged to friends. Some belonged to enemies. Some belonged to people who had been dead for years. History became personal again. Not armies. Individuals. Not campaigns. Conversations. Not empires. Relationships. His companions sometimes listened quietly. Sometimes recorded observations. Sometimes simply sat nearby. Presence became more important than discussion. Words matter. But there are moments when companionship matters more. And this was one of those moments. The atmosphere inside Longwood House changed in other ways as well. Voices grew softer. Movements became gentler. Doors closed more carefully. People walked more quietly through hallways. Nobody issued instructions demanding such behavior. It happened naturally. Human beings often adjust themselves unconsciously around illness, around grief, around approaching loss. The house seemed to understand what was coming. Doctors visited frequently. Their arrival rarely generated excitement anymore. Earlier in the illness, every visit had carried possibility. Perhaps a new treatment. Perhaps improvement. Perhaps recovery. Now expectations had become more modest. Relief rather than cure. Comfort rather than recovery. Medicine has limits. 19th century medicine possessed even more limits. The physicians did what they could, which, unfortunately, was not enough. Napoleon's appetite declined. Sleep became irregular. Strength continued fading. The progression followed a familiar path, one that countless families have witnessed throughout history. The details change. The emotions remain remarkably similar. There were moments of frustration. Naturally, Napoleon had spent most of his life exercising influence over events. Watching events proceed beyond his control could not have been easy. Some days he appeared restless. Other days resigned. Human emotions rarely move in straight lines. Acceptance and resistance often coexist. One hour brings calm. The next brings anger. Then calm returns. The cycle repeats. The companions observed these shifts closely. How could they not? The entire household revolved around Napoleon's condition. His comfort, his mood, his health. The routines of Longwood House gradually narrowed until almost everything centered upon a single concern: the man at its center. Outside, Europe felt impossibly distant. News arrived slowly. Political developments seemed strangely abstract. Governments changed. Policies changed. The world moved forward. Yet inside Longwood House, time felt different. Smaller. More intimate. More fragile. A single day could seem enormously important. A single conversation could acquire lasting significance. The scale of existence had contracted. The former ruler of vast territories now measured success differently. A comfortable morning. A peaceful afternoon. A good night's rest. Simple things. Things many people overlook. Things that become precious when health begins disappearing. The irony was impossible to miss. Napoleon had once controlled armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Now a quiet evening represented a meaningful victory. Life has a way of redefining priorities, especially near the end. As spring approached in 1821, the decline accelerated. Even those who had clung to hope began recognizing reality. The situation was becoming irreversible. Visitors noticed immediately. Descriptions from the period often mention weakness, fatigue, physical deterioration. The image differed sharply from popular memories of Napoleon. The energetic commander riding across battlefields. The ambitious ruler issuing orders. The confident leader addressing crowds. Those versions still existed, but only in memory. The present told a different story. A human story. An ordinary story in some respects. Because illness eventually reduces even extraordinary lives to familiar experiences. Pain, fatigue, dependence, reflection. The same realities faced by countless individuals throughout history. Power provides many advantages. Immunity from mortality is not among them. Longwood House grew quieter. The conversations shortened. The pauses lengthened. Sometimes entire rooms sat in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Not empty silence. A thoughtful silence. The kind that develops when people recognize words are becoming less necessary. Everyone understood, even when nobody spoke about it directly. The end was approaching, slowly, patiently, inevitably. And as April drifted toward May, the winds continued moving across Saint Helena. The ocean continued surrounding the island. The clouds continued crossing the sky. While inside Longwood House, a small group of loyal companions watched over an aging emperor whose extraordinary journey was nearing its final destination. The battles were over. The arguments were fading. The memories remained. And around them all settled a growing stillness. A stillness that seemed to deepen each day. a stillness that felt less like silence and more like history holding its breath. By late April of 1821, Longwood House no longer felt like a residence. It felt like a vigil. The difference is subtle. A residence is a place where people live. A vigil is a place where people wait. And now everyone was waiting. Waiting for improvement that never quite arrived. Waiting for reassurance that never quite came. Waiting for news that nobody wanted to hear. The final days of Napoleon Bonaparte had begun. Not that anyone could identify the exact moment. Life rarely provides clear chapter headings. There is no trumpet announcing. Attention everyone, the final 10 days are now commencing. Instead, reality unfolds gradually. One difficult morning becomes several difficult mornings. One bad week becomes another. Then, eventually, people begin to understand. The direction is no longer uncertain. Only the timing remains unknown. Napoleon spent much of his time in bed. The illness had advanced considerably. Even speaking could require effort. Even listening could become exhausting. The body that had once crossed continents seemed increasingly unwilling to continue the journey. Yet the mind remained active, at least part of the time. Memories still surfaced. Observations still emerged. Fragments of conversation still appeared. Though often separated by longer periods of silence, the companions who surrounded him became increasingly protective. Every movement seemed important. Every meal seemed important. Every improvement generated cautious optimism. Every setback generated renewed concern. Such is the strange rhythm of serious illness. Hope and realism dance endlessly together. Neither fully defeats the other. Not until the very end. The weather outside matched the mood inside. Saint Helena remained Saint Helena. The island had no intention of becoming cheerful simply because history was unfolding. Clouds drifted across the hills. Rain appeared intermittently. Wind swept across the plateau. The landscape remained gray and restless. Visitors often described the island as lonely. During those final days, loneliness seemed woven into every scene. Longwood House stood isolated. Napoleon lay isolated. Even the island itself existed in isolation from the rest of the world. It was as though geography and circumstance had joined forces to create the perfect setting for a final act. One of the most interesting aspects of these last days involves memory. Because memory becomes increasingly complicated near the end of life, the boundary between present and past sometimes grows thinner. Old events feel recent. Recent events feel distant. A conversation from 30 years ago may seem clearer than something that happened yesterday. Witnesses later reported moments when Napoleon appeared to drift between times and places. Not constantly, not dramatically, just occasionally. A phrase, a name, a reference to long-ago campaigns, a fragment of military language. The past remained close, closer than ever. And perhaps that is understandable. After all, Napoleon's past contained enough material for several lifetimes. His memories stretched from revolutionary France to imperial Europe, from obscure artillery officer to emperor, from victory to defeat, from coronation to exile. The sheer scale of experience must have been difficult to contain, especially when the present offered so little distraction. During quieter moments, companions sat nearby. Sometimes conversation occurred. Sometimes it did not. Presence alone mattered. Human beings often underestimate the value of simply being there. Words have limits. Companionship does not always require them. One can imagine the atmosphere. The subdued voices, the careful footsteps, the occasional creaking of floorboards. distant sound of wind outside, the awareness shared by everyone in the room. History was approaching a conclusion. Napoleon himself seemed increasingly detached from ordinary concerns. The disputes that had once consumed his attention faded into the background. Arguments with Governor Lowe no longer mattered very much. Administrative frustrations no longer mattered very much. The endless irritations of Saint Helena no longer mattered very much. Perspective changes rapidly when time becomes limited. Things that once appeared enormous suddenly seem trivial. The mind begins sorting priorities differently. By this stage, Napoleon's world had narrowed to a few essential things: comfort, memory, companionship, and perhaps hope. Though hope had changed its shape, it no longer focused on recovery, or escape, or a political return. Instead, it seemed directed toward legacy, toward remembrance, toward meaning. The questions occupying him were no longer about what he might accomplish. They were about what would remain. That distinction matters. For most of his life, Napoleon had lived in the future, planning, anticipating, preparing. Now he lived largely in reflection, reviewing, remembering, evaluating. The transition was profound. As the days passed, periods of consciousness became more uneven. Some hours brought clarity, others brought confusion. Observers recorded scattered remarks, fragments rather than speeches, pieces rather than complete narratives. And that is important to remember. Popular culture often imagines famous people delivering perfectly composed final statements. Reality tends to be messier, far messier. Human beings rarely conclude their lives with carefully scripted speeches. They remain human until the end. Napoleon was no exception. Still, certain words survived. Certain phrases became famous. Among the most frequently repeated were references to France, to the army, to military memories. These reports vary somewhat depending upon the witness, which is hardly surprising. Witnesses rarely agree perfectly, especially during emotional moments. Yet the general theme remained consistent. The things that had defined Napoleon's life remained close to him during its final chapter. France, the army, the past, the great story of his existence. Outside, the island continued its ordinary routines. Somewhere soldiers stood watch. Somewhere ships moved across distant waters. Somewhere residents carried on with daily life. The contrast is striking. One of history's most extraordinary lives approached its conclusion, while ordinary existence continued uninterrupted. This happens constantly. History books focus on remarkable individuals. Reality contains millions of simultaneous stories. Most pass unnoticed. Even famous deaths occur against a backdrop of ordinary afternoons. By early May, the situation had become unmistakable. The decline accelerated. Energy disappeared. Strength disappeared. The companions remained close. Doctors remained attentive. Yet everyone understood. The destination was near. Then came May 5th, 1821. The final day. The weather was unsettled. Clouds hung over Saint Helena. Rain moved across parts of the island. The atmosphere felt heavy. At Longwood House, the vigil reached its conclusion. Napoleon's condition worsened throughout the day. The hours passed slowly. The room remained quiet. Visitors came and went carefully. Companions stayed nearby, watching, waiting, remembering. At approximately 5:49 in the afternoon, Napoleon Bonaparte died, 51 years old, far from France, far from Paris, far from the battlefields that had defined his career, far from the palaces where he had once ruled. The moment itself was quiet. No cannons, no crowds, no ceremonies. Only a room, a handful of witnesses, and the end of a remarkable life. There is something deeply moving about that simplicity. History often remembers the grand moments, the coronations, the victories, the dramatic speeches. Yet many lives conclude in quiet rooms surrounded by a few familiar faces. Napoleon's life proved no exception. The scale of the story did not alter the nature of the ending. For a few moments after his death, the room remained still. The companions absorbed the reality. The doctors performed their duties. The silence deepened. Years of exile had ended. Years of illness had ended. The long struggle was over. Outside, the wind continued moving across the hills. The ocean continued breaking against distant cliffs. Saint Helena remained unchanged. But inside Longwood House, something had shifted forever. The prisoner was gone. The exile was gone. The emperor was gone. Only the memory remained. And memory, as Napoleon himself understood better than most, can be extraordinarily powerful. The man who had once commanded armies would never issue another order. The man who had once redrawn maps would never alter another border. The man who had once stood at the center of Europe would never again see France. Yet in a strange way, his final journey was only beginning. Because death had ended Napoleon the person, what came next would create Napoleon the legend. And legends, unlike emperors, are not confined by islands. They travel wherever memory carries them. Across oceans, across generations, across centuries. Long after the rain stopped falling on Saint Helena, long after Longwood House fell silent, long after every witness had passed away, the story would continue. Because some lives become history, and a very small number become myth. Napoleon Bonaparte was already beginning that transformation. Even before the sun had set on the day he died, one might assume that death brings certainty. After all, a person's story has ended. The final page has been written. The questions have been answered. History can neatly close the book and move on. Unfortunately, history rarely behaves so conveniently, and Napoleon Bonaparte, even in death, proved incapable of making things simple. Because almost immediately after he died, a new mystery emerged. How exactly had he died? At first glance, the answer appeared obvious. He had been ill for years. His health had steadily deteriorated. His final months had been marked by increasing weakness and pain. The conclusion seemed straightforward. Yet straightforward conclusions have a tendency to make historians nervous, especially when famous people are involved, especially when empires, politics, and conspiracy theories are involved. And Napoleon's story contained all three. The day after his death, preparations began for an autopsy. This was not unusual. Given Napoleon's importance, authorities wanted answers. His companions wanted answers. The doctors wanted answers. And perhaps most importantly, history wanted answers. An examination would provide evidence, or at least everyone hoped it would. The procedure took place on Saint Helena on May 6, 1821. Several doctors participated. British physicians attended. French witnesses attended. Observations were carefully recorded. The atmosphere was serious, professional, and perhaps slightly surreal. Only a few years earlier, Europe's governments had feared this man intensely. Now physicians stood quietly examining his remains. History moves quickly sometimes. The findings appeared significant. Napoleon's stomach showed extensive disease, particularly a large ulcerated lesion. The damage was severe.